Hello, friends. Welcome to Season 2 of the Club podcast. Each week, we bring you long-form conversations with the people building at the edges of crypto and community. At Seed Club, we believe in a world where people, not platforms, capture the value created online, and where community-owned networks are some of the most valuable organizations in the world. Join us for a front row seat to the latest insights and tactical learnings at the intersection of crypto and community. Today, I'm joined by generative audio-visual artist Deafbeef. Bit of a different episode. I think we've had an NFT artist on so far. Deafbeef is just a really thoughtful, caring, considerate individual who kind of got caught up in this NFT rush, for better or for worse. We got into how he got into creative coding and making generative art, what makes gen art so special, especially when paired with the blockchain. Dive into lessons in going from 0 to 1 and how Deafbeef has navigated that. And finally, we talk about the role Zappa has played in his life. This was a fun episode. I really enjoyed getting to know Tyler. I think you will too, so let's get into it. Deafbeef, welcome to Club.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
I love this because Samson and I on our team set up this connection here, and I don't think he knew just how much of a fan I've been of yours since the earliest days. I think this idea of like on-chain generative art was such a major shift for me in my mind around NFTs, and there's no secret that I'm a big fan of art blocks and Chromie Squiggles and Squiggle DAO and all this sort of stuff. And I remember seeing one of your first drops and being like, oh, and it's kind of gone crazy since then. We haven't had a conversation with somebody like yourself who's sort of been in purely this art and creative way, very, Reddit's sort of the nexus of, I think, what was a fairly large explosion through last year. So stoked to get into the conversation, but maybe you could just do a brief introduction on who you are and what you're up to.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, it's been definitely quite the ride, right, since that time last year. Yeah, sure. So brief introduction. So I'm best known as the artist Deafbeef. I'm an audio-visual generative artist. And so in my art practice, I write code. When run, it produces animation and sound. I use these code systems as tools to explore different kinds of aesthetic possibilities with animation and sound. And I was doing this all before I became aware basically of NFTs and Ethereum about a year ago. I've been tinkering with lots of things my whole life, with computers and art and music and sound and different things, but it all kind of met and intersected in a wild way about this time last year with the ability for these code systems to be stored on chain. And so there was this big kind of thing that came around that. Everybody knows art blocks and people know autoglyphs. And so in a way, I've piggybacked on sort of like what took place with those things. So yeah, I'm basically like, I'm a tinkerer. That's what I've done. And it's kind of circumstantial that it's kind of ended up this way. But yeah, I like to explore systems, different types of systems, and one of those is code systems, and for audiovisual generative artwork.
For me, as I said earlier, this generative art movement was like or on-chain generative art, sort of like, it reminded me of my experience in discovering Ethereum early on. It's like a thing that you see and like, you're like, okay, that's kind of cool. What's going on there? And then as you sort of start to pull back the layers, you see that there's something very net new here. How would you sort of describe that? What makes gen art so special, especially when it relates to being on-chain?
Sure, yeah. So for me, like generative art, generative art itself is not new to me, right? Like I've been programming since I was a kid, and like my first experience with procedural or generative content actually came from playing these roguelike dungeon crawler games as a kid. I don't know if people are familiar with any of these games, like Rogue, NetHack. These all inspired like Minecraft and other ones, and Dwarf Fortress. But so they're really basic visually, right? And it's just like a 2D map of symbols. But the really interesting thing about it was that every time you play it, it's a new level, right? Like it's unique. It's randomly generated. And like, that's just fascinating. And that was what really motivated me to explore creative coding. And that was my big motivation for programming, to learning to do that. It's because I wanted to write games that could do that. And then throughout that, I studied engineering, computer science, and I was aware of people using code to synthesize images. And in fact, I went on later and did some grad work in computer graphics. And so I knew about the history and, people trying to develop techniques in industry, like for films and video games, for people in a certain group, like synthesizing images or synthesizing something with code is not really kind of new, but has a long history, varied history, lots of different kind of factions and things that have happened. But what's happened with how that's intersected with Ethereum is certainly very interesting. And so I didn't know about Ethereum. I've been really living kind of under a rock, very bare bones existence, just caring for our young kids for many years. And so I didn't actually know about, I knew of Ethereum, but I didn't realize it was a programmable distributed blockchain until like a year and a half ago. I hadn't considered it. When I saw that taking place, like it clued into me, it just like hit me like a ton of bricks, right? And I saw what was happening with the success of other generative artists and like especially with art blocks. And yeah, it makes so much sense. The ability to take these code systems and then to have them on chain, and you can provably have them permanent in a sense, and also provably have the seed that's going to generate it as part of it. There's a communal aspect. People participate in minting. That's just fascinating. It's like lightning in a bottle. And that's like so many things have come out of that.
From the outside, it looked like the thing that you put out just took off immediately. I'm curious what like that earliest days from when you actually wrote the code, were ready to go live with it. I saw you make a number of decisions there that were maybe contrary to how most people were launching generative art on chain at the time. Many were going through art blocks at the time, and you specifically launched on your own site. You have a very clear aesthetic there. It seems as if you made a lot of decisions that were kind of contrary to maybe some of the traditional, I mean, that's not the right word. Like, it was very counter to, you're not doing massive drops, you're not doing a whole bunch of promotion around it. So can you take us back to that early set of decisions maybe you made just as you were about to launch?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things happening there. Like I was working on my generative art practice, like making sound, right? Especially in animation. And then I saw what was happening in the space and with art blocks. And I joined the art blocks community. I would have probably wanted to release with art blocks, but there was a backup. Like already by then, there was like a lot of attention around it. I would have had to wait like many, many months to even be considered. But another big consideration was that my mode of working, I've intentionally chosen like a specific set of tools. I write code in C, in a language called C. It's a very kind of basic fundamental language. And since I started doing this, there's a whole backstory, but like I want to try to use the most basic minimal tool set. So I use like a cheap laptop and a C compiler and a text editor and nothing else. Like I don't want to use a browser or any type of like open source libraries or anything. Just for the fun of it, I want to build it from scratch. I want to reinvent the wheel, do it on my own. That's the way I was working. And I was thinking, okay, well, to plug into this, like maybe I should, do some JavaScript and have it in a browser, but there's trade-offs. The trade-offs for what I wanted to do, it didn't make sense. So I thought, you know what? Okay, I'll do it on my own. Continue what I'm doing. I'm going to use C code. And I'm going to store that on the blockchain. I'm going to have my own setup. So I had to, in a hurry, learn Solidity because I didn't have an experience with that. And so that was kind of a blur. Those few weeks were a blur. I don't know how I got it all together in that time, but there was a big motivation. I mean, it's a rush, right? To plant your flag and so to speak. Also, I'd been working with sound. Like that was what I was always interested in, generating music and sound. It was only the visuals were sort of at that point sort of secondary. There's reasons for that as well. And so there was another project that had at the time called Euler Beats, and they were doing generative music as well. And I saw that there was a tension around this, and I already had stuff that I had worked on, and I wanted to show it. I wanted to share it, right? Because I thought it had value, and within the context of all these things popping up, I just wanted to put it out there. And so that's some of the context around how it came to be. I shared that work with those communities. Like, I mean, I wouldn't be anywhere without those communities. I shared it with Euler Beats Discord, with Art Blocks, and also 0xMons. This is, if people know that community, and Owen, who's the developer, doing on-chain, highly technical stuff. And I was also part of that community to begin with. Those three communities together, like that really kind of helped having sort of an audience to begin with. The audience was there because of these other like projects and stuff that had existed. So I can't take credit for any of that. I'm really happy for the support of those early communities in doing that.
I love how so many of those decisions were just first principles decisions, maybe, like, and it led to this, I think, brand that you've built here that is very cohesive. And again, I think it stands apart from so much that's out there. But also I'm reminded just how fun it was to be in those communities. when this was all happening. There
It
was
was super
such
fun.
creativity, right?
It was a really, really exciting time, right? And like at that point, it hadn't gone completely nuts yet. Although it was still kind of nuts, like in some senses, but it hadn't gone completely nuts. And so there was just like electricity. Like it was just like I guess people call it a vibe now, right? But that's the word for it, is vibe. But yeah, that was such a great time. It was really, really fun. I didn't have any expectations about how this. I just knew that I wanted to share it, right? And so when I set up like the mint schedule, and then like I was like, yeah, we're gonna do a test. I'm gonna make 10 available of the first series of synth poems. Gas is high right now. Like there's 10 available. Just wait till over the weekend. Maybe gas will go lower and you could buy it. And then people just grab them, right? And that just floored me. It completely floored me. Like in like a few minutes, I went to take a bathroom break and I came back and they'd minted out. And it was 0.05 ETH, I think. And there was 10 of them, but that just blew me away. It just really blew me away. And people flooding into the Discord. And it wasn't just so much that they want to grab it for like speculation. People were also interested. Like the community aspect to it like blew me away. I've been working in isolation for the longest time. I don't have like fans or like, you know, like groups of like or even like an artist network or anything like that. It's just been me on my own because that's what I've been used to. And then I have this Discord and there's people interested in my work and they want to know my history and they want to know my influences. And they want to know how this stuff works. They want to know about generative music. It's just wild. Yeah. It took some adjustment, but yeah, very interesting time.
Tell me about that. I mean, that is a big shift from your relative obscurity.
Yeah, it was a big shift. And I mean, at that point, that was still early on and it was super fun. Like there's this community and it was also manageable too. It was exciting and it took effort, but it was manageable. It was really fun to interact with people that were genuinely interested in all these things, right? Like in code-based art, in sound synthesis. Even if they didn't know much about it, like they were just really interested in it. And also what's novel about on-chain generative art, it's a communal experience. And so people minting stuff and then seeing what they got and then comparing it and searching out things and like really kind of, there's an element to it that is participatory. You know, like people would listen to some synth poems and like, you know, talk about why they liked it or like what it reminded them of, or like why certain ones were preferable to others and for what reasons. So there's this analysis going on. And that's only fun if you're doing it with other people, right? And so that community, and especially like Discord itself, like that Discord was part of it. I'd never been in a Discord before. I didn't know about this tool. That was part of the experience. We couldn't have it without it. That is the metaverse, basically, right? And so, and I didn't have a Twitter account either. So joining Twitter and just like the, you know, really rapid pace of exchanges and stuff on Twitter as well.
I love this. I mean, it's like just such a great example of the leverage, the empowerment that can come from this technology. And so I can imagine the experience of going from that early drop. Like I remember that drop. I remember being late to that drop. Now that I know that you were in the bathroom when that drop was happening, I feel like I have an even deeper understanding or connection here to you. So, but like it quickly got crazy. And so I think that, I mean, this delta from, I mean, am I right in saying that you were doing some metalwork and stuff beforehand? Your art was a lot more tactical. Is that correct, or am I misremembering?
That's right. So, like, I mean, I've done a lot of different things to support myself. But one of the things, like, I've always coded. I've been doing web applications and contract work and stuff for 20 years, I think. And to try to give me the opportunity so that I have time to do something else that doesn't have to depend on what it sells for or whatever. And one of those things was I became interested in working metal, and it was from watching on YouTube when YouTube first started getting popular. Now you could see all these videos of things, and I was inspired by the work of Arthur Ganson. He's a sculptor that makes machines by himself, and they're very kind of whimsical, and they're made out of wire, and he made them all himself on his own. And I was really inspired to work metal because of that. And so from there, I went down kind of this rabbit hole and I started taking metalworking classes. I wanted to learn how to machine and weld to make kinetic sculpture. And then forging. So that's when you heat metal and you beat it with a hammer. I thought that was fascinating. And so I started doing that as a hobby. And that developed to the point where like I was making things, craft work and stuff and trying to sell it. And rings were very popular. And so for the past several years, it turned into a full-time business. My employment for the past 3 or 4 years has been custom making hand-forged wedding rings out of materials like titanium, stainless steel. Yeah, not necessarily precious metals, basically forgeable metals. That's been my job, basically. I made over 3,000 handmade wedding rings for people.
I love that as contrast. So it's like this very IRL, very with your hands type thing. And it seems that's just in your brief conversation here, a fairly big trend in whether it's digital or physical, like this sort of, I'll say DIY, but it's probably not like the right way to capture that. But that existence to the insanity of an NFT bull market. What was that experience like? And how the heck did you deal with that? I mean, it seems like there's such a big gap between your existence before and kind of where you are maybe 6-8 months ago.
What it felt like was being parachuted into unknown territory, right? Because also personally, like I'm just sort of an introverted person. My wife and I, like our kids are now like 6 and 8, right? And ever since our kids were born, we've basically been living in a bubble, right? I've always worked from home. Like I said, like I've been doing these other things and supporting myself through either programming or kind of these endeavors. And so I work in my basement in my garage. I don't go anywhere. Like I'm just doing things here. I'm very happy to do it that way. I like just exploring on my own. So just kind of limited social interaction with my immediate family. And then when the pandemic hit, it was sort of more of the same, like for us. Luckily, we're privileged to be able to have that opportunity, but that's the way it was. And so that's really like I didn't have a Zoom set up. I'd never done a podcast before all this happened, right? My laptop was 8 or 9 years old. It was a really big kind of change when things started really to start ramping up. And like I said, it was really awesome in the beginning and also very exciting as things wrapped up. But eventually it became like anxiety provoking, just like not knowing, uncertainty about like what it meant, what was real, what was not, because you're getting a lot of different signals and stuff. You don't know how long any of this will last. You don't know. It's very hard to judge the sincerity of every actor. It's really, really tough. So a lot of different emotions, a lot of different things to deal with. I mean, I say this all like I'm really grateful for everything that's happened. Obviously, like, you know, like the success and the attention. At the same time, like just being honest, like it's been a really, really big change. Yeah, I could talk about any of those things, but it's kind of like a big kind of ball of, you know, wax. So
I think a part that many of us are going to be thinking a lot more about as maybe that insanity hit sort of slows down a little bit and there's some reflection to be done. But, you know, human beings are the core of these things. It's the core of, you know, obviously you are a human being who's making this art, and having, you know, experienced a version of that, I think not as sort of intense as I think I'd imagine your experience was. You had to experience it, like the intensity and volume and just everything was just you just max gained everything, right? It was crazy. And I think it's definitely important to sort of put a pin in, because your story so far is one of like poster guy challenge of this, or opportunity, right? Like you've sort of plugged into this global network, and the whole stories of how creators are going to be able to be empowered by Ethereum and by NFTs and all this sort of stuff are very much like your proof of that here. And so I think like, well, it's going to be different in the future, how people experience that. Going from 0 to 100 in anything. I mean, I've been in a Tesla recently. Like there's a reaction on your body that you know comes from that I think we need to at least own. And especially if you don't have support networks and systems around you. And I think, you know, again, I just, you know, core to what we believe here at C Club is that community is where value flows in Web3. And I think having those people around us are so key. And I love how you're sort of calling out the difficulty in judging sincerity. I haven't heard it phrased that way, but I think that is just a phenomenal way to put some of the challenge of kind of being in this hypermania, because a large number of folks come into these things through speculative intents. And it's difficult to be able to understand the difference between them and somebody else in your Discord server. And the noise ramps up significantly. And if you're somebody who takes a lot of feedback and are sensitive to that world or to other people, it's a challenge. And I don't think we should try to hide that by any means.
Yep. I guess this is the terminology I've heard recently, but it's a 0 to 1 moment.
Yeah.
Which is what I think the VC threads like to use that one. So.
Oh, yes. And there are lots of those opining today, that's for sure. So I've noticed like you have run a number of drops, experiments, sort of creations here. Can you sort of take us through how those have evolved from some of your earliest work into the more recent things?
Sure. Okay. So my earliest drop was synth poems. And so that was an audiovisual generative artwork that was focused mostly on the audio, but had all my work has a visual component. That one was, I actually almost released that one only as audio, right? And I was just going to have like a placeholder token. And then kind of at the last minute, I think like one evening, I made the visualization. So it's kind of weird how those things come together. But that was the first drop. And that the paradigm of that was very similar to like an art blocks drop, like that paradigm, when you mint it, there's a random seed. And so when you mint it, you get something unique from the output from the code. And so I knew from the beginning when I designed that contract, I knew that I didn't want to just do one drop. Like I didn't want it to just be one thing. It was going to be a collection of different series, like one after the other. Because I would rather have, I knew from the get-go that like I had a bunch of ideas and I would rather have kind of like smaller editions of many series rather than just one. There's enough to explore that made sense to do that. And I thought it also works more like cohesively. Like I like when you take music tracks and you sequence them, like an album is another form of composition. It's not just a collection of tracks. It's like having them in sequence says something about them. That context like adds something to it. So I knew I wanted to do that. And so the second and third drops that I did were sort of lower edition. There was just 8 compared to 128 for synth poems. They were named Angular and Transmission. And these were based on audiovisual models that I had sort of I already had all this sort of built up from my art practice preceding that year. These two were just to kind of showcase those things, maybe a little bit of commentary about like the Transmission includes like some text snippets that talk about like the lingo and crypto and things, and it's just to tie it in with some of those references. I like having a lot of different references and layers that people can kind of peel back and dig into it in a lot of different ways. I've always liked work that's like that. It's not just one thing, so you can kind of, you can go deep into it. So there's those two. And then the fourth series that I did was called Entropy. And this is where I started to explore something that I knew that I'd wanted to explore when I built the contract. So I want to try to see what can we do with smart contracts themselves, like beyond just it being about generative art or the aesthetics or something. Is there something unique to this medium that we can further explore? Because we're right in the beginning, right? Like it's like there's so much low-hanging fruit. The next couple of series, I wanted to try to explore some of those things. And Entropy is probably the best example of it. Entropy is an NFT. It's an audiovisual NFT, and the smart contract keeps track of how many times it's been transferred. I override the transfer function. It's really simple. I just keep a counter that says, okay, it's been transferred once or twice or 3 times. And then that info can go to your code model. Because the generative art code model doesn't just have to be a random hash. It could be input from anywhere. That can have meaning. And so that's one thing that could be input to this model. I use that to tell the model to have this kind of process of artificial degradation that makes it look like the audiovisual is decaying the same way if you were to repeatedly copy a photograph or, record something to tape over and over again. It's going to become less distinct. It's going to have more noise until eventually, after many, many transfers, you won't be able to distinguish it at all. That's Entropy. And I thought that it explores some things that are like really kind of central to blockchain, like the idea of permanence, and like especially with like the idea of generative art. It's like, okay, this is permanent. We're putting it on chains there forever. It's immutable. Also about like value and ownership. Like, what does it mean to own something? And like, these are central themes to like what we're doing, right? Like in the culture as well as in the technology, about things being permanent and about being able to own them. And so this work is really a comment on those two themes and kind of turns it around a little bit, because is it permanent? It might be just the illusion of permanence, because nothing is truly permanent, right? And so it degrades, and what happens to the value because of that? Do you own it? And if you own it, what does that mean? That's my favorite work. Entropy is my favorite work. And these ideas about something degrading, I should say, like, that's not new. And I'm sure other people have had the idea to have an NFT that degrades. Like, it's not really new. Out of circumstance, it really came together for that series for just a bunch of reasons. Just being there at the right time when there was the opportunity to doing that. And the aesthetics worked in such a way that it worked on its own, even aesthetically. The music and the sound and the visuals, it's an easily understood statement. So that's Entropy. After Entropy, the next series was called Glitchbox. And so this is also generative audiovisual artwork, but rather than at the time of mint, like usually like in the generative art paradigm where it's fixed when you mint it. Like once you mint it, that's it. Then it's random, it's new, but then it's fixed. You can't change it. There's no reason that it has to be that way. Right. So my background with I had been inspired to start working in the way I was doing, partly because of modular synthesizers and like making sound using these machines that have patch cables, and there's inputs and there's outputs, and this kind of system level thinking. They can have multiple inputs. They change, like everything's changing. When you play an instrument, you can tune the knobs and get something else, right? When you do your patch on your modular synthesizer, you can tune it, and that's what's fun. And the reason that a lot of people want to work with generative art is to experience that, right? Like you're doing the exploration. Seeing generative art, for a lot of people, it's not because they want to collect it. They don't want to take it and hang on the wall. My previous interactions with people after sharing things on Instagram has been predominantly people want to know, hey, do you have a GitHub? Do you have an open source? I want to start doing this stuff. Like, this is exciting, right? That's where the excitement is. And it's a remix culture. There's sharing and all these things around it. And so again, I'm sure lots of people were thinking about this idea as well, but I implemented my version of it. It's kind of like a glitch synthesizer. It does some like video art that are in a style that's influenced by the ASCII roguelikes that dungeon crawler games from when I was a kid. And then also kind of TV glitches and scanline television. And sounds that are synthesized according to some parameters. But the parameters I allowed people to change. Right. So in the smart contract, you can set it up so the owner has the ability to update parameters. They submit transactions. And when doing that, you change some numbers that change the inputs to the code model, and then it regenerates. And so you can play it. You can kind of clunkily play it like an instrument in the same way that you would turn knobs or sliders and stuff on your synth and get a different output. And that was super fun because people were doing it and they were having fun with it. And we had remix competitions, right, to like win a glitch box. Like you would program one, you could set it up as the owner that people don't have to own it. They could be editors, so they have privileges to come and try to do it. And so we have competitions and people would have a glitch off and see what they could do. So that was like this participatory aspect kind of speaks to the culture of generative art and sharing and stuff. And I'm really happy with the way that one turned out. At that point, when that released, that was probably the most fun that I've had in the space with my work. That was a great period of time. So I could talk about the last series that's on that contract. And so it's called Advection. And so this was a physical simulation of fluids. I have a background in computer animation. I studied I did some research in computer animation, and specifically 10 years ago, I came up with this new model to simulate efficiently the fluid motion. And I made at the time, I think it ran on my smartphone like 10 years ago, right? And so I had this ready to go. I'd spent 2 years of my life doing this. I published at SIGGRAPH. It's a big conference in computer graphics. And it wasn't really useful for film because of what it was, but it was really useful just for what I wanted it to do, was to make cool, swirly animations in 2 dimensions and being able to control interactively. And there's something about it that was unique to the way that I made that system. And you can't really get it any other way. So for my last series, I used that system. And again, I made it so that it was interactive in the sense that people can update the parameters. And that was Advection. And then after that, that was sort of the end of the audio-visual series of that contract.
Yeah, I love how consistent so much of this is, and yet how incredibly different each drop has been and experience has been. Like from the sounds to the vibe to it. Advections very much feels more wavy and chill. But if some of your early work was kind of like, what the hell's going on here? This is feels very digital and hard edges and beeps and boops sort of thing. And yet at the same time, it's just, you see your work, it's your work, especially from those early drops. I'm curious how there's this sort of, I guess, friction that can pop up, I think, in creators and artists where you go from the tinkering, the creative, to all of a sudden you're running a business. And it sounds like you've done that in a few different ways in the last little while. I'm curious, what does the business of Deafbeef look like today?
Oh, that's the thing. Everything changes so fast, right? So if you ask me what the business of Deafbeef is today, it's a lot different than it was 3 months ago and way different than 6 months ago, all right? So today I feel a little bit more grounded than I did in the summer. And so in terms of the business model of Deafbeef, I'm trying to find the fundamental sort of guardrails, right? I want to continue my art practice and trust that process, right? I'm trying to get back to that, basically. I'm trying to get back to what I was doing before all of NFTs and Ethereum, essentially, right? Which was taking time to explore and to tinker and see what comes out of it, right? And give myself the opportunity to do that. That's why I do it. And I don't see why it should change now. My goal is to get back to that kind of state where I have time where I just do those things. And I guess okay, so then on top of that, in terms of the business I've put on my business hat, there's a lot of new things that I have to learn because I was not a professional artist before all this. I was an artist because I just made art, right? And that's fine. I didn't know anything about the art world or even the gallery system or even anything, right? People look at me funny, someone wanted to do a studio visit and I didn't know what that was. It was oh, so you want to come to my, what does that mean? I don't have a studio, right?
Come hang out in my garage. Let's go.
Right? And so I just didn't know. I didn't speak the language, any of that. So it's been learning about like all those things, and people are really supportive, and I'm building a network, of great people, and now sorting out and stuff, and like I know like people that I can trust, and I have like certain values that I had before, and I want to continue them. And so like, what does Deafbeef stand for, right? Like, what does that word mean, right? And that's sort of what I want the brand to be like. And when I think about what those are, and like that's where it's supposed to sort of go from.
I think that is really fascinating. There is that pro world that is out there and has been out there for the longest time. And while there are many sort of, let's say, NFT artists that are out there that I very much feel are like playing the NFT game, your work feels very much more like fine art. I don't know how you even respond to that specific label there, but to me, and even just how you've structured your drops and your releases here, it's like, it's not about the biggest thing. It's not about going as wide as possible. Like, to me, this is a thing that you're going to walk into a modern art museum and, it's going to be the center of a room. And I think that's a really interesting, as we start to see like the different lanes that kind of start to develop within Web3 world and the different things that tokens can sort of roll out. Where so much of this NFT excitement started was in the one-of-ones and the smaller collections and like in it for the art type thing. And where it's sort of gone in the last little while is definitely more speculation games and larger collection sizes, etc. So it's interesting. I've noticed it's been a while since you've actually done a release. I'm assuming that is purposeful and sort of like getting back to your roots, sort of figuring out what the next step is. But
I am trying to take like a long-term view. Right. And I'm fortunate and privileged enough that I can take that view. Right. Because I don't begrudge anybody during like NFT mania and stuff. Like, get paid. You're an artist, like, get paid. It's fine. Once you find yourself in a position where you have the opportunity to make that decision, I don't depend on it for sustenance, like to put a roof over my head or feed my kids. Then there's decisions that you can make. And the decision that I've made is that I do want to take sort of a longer term view. What's special about I see it, the sequence of series, like I've said, it's like a composition. It's like an album. Like, I'm really picky about like what I want to place within that sequence, because it says something within the context. What we've seen like in this time is that there's been a lot of people have been working for like decades, and they have all this stuff built up, and it's just never been monetized, like, so to speak. So they've invested time and effort and stuff and all these things. And then when this new market like occurs, you have all these great ideas like ready to go. Like I said, like Advection was something that I did 10 years ago. And it took me 2 years to make that. And to make any of this, like, it's sort of been like a culmination of a lot of different experiences. I'm not holding back. Like, I don't have another ace up my sleeve. It's just that's all I got, right? Like, for right now, right? And so, like, it's nice the way that it worked. It was like, okay, well, I have a bunch of things to explore, and I can sort of do them right now just because the pool of creators right now is pretty small, and like we have this sort of like stuff that's sort of ready to go, and like there's low-hanging fruit. It's nice the way it went, that it was like, oh, everything builds on itself. And so these 6 series kind of really like build on themselves, but you can only take that so far. I don't have anything to follow up Advection, and I knew that at the time. It's like, you know what? Okay, Advection. I'm going to take a break after that and see how it goes. And then things went wild in the summer anyways. And so I'm really just observing. I'm listening. I want to make meaningful work. I don't want to really repeat myself so much. Yeah, I want to take a nuanced like approach to it. I have done some drops like since that. They're not as well known, and they kind of taken a different direction. And I could talk about those if you want. But I did a drop in September, and I did one in January that maybe you or some other people might not know about.
I do not know about it, so I'm fascinated.
Oh, okay. All right. So in September, at the peak of hypeness, right? Like, just like crazy, like actually after Loot, if people remember Loot. Loot is completely on chain, made by Dom Hoffman, and it's text. It's like a list of like the bare essentials of like, it's just names of items. Really fascinating stuff. And so at that time, there was huge hype around my artwork. I was in a state of craziness, right? Like just anxiety and not knowing what was going on, because it made no sense. And we can see that now. But I made a series of generative texts that were inspired by Loot, but don't have anything conceptually to do with Loot. There's a series of generative texts that it's like Mad Libs that talk about various observed combinations of things about the first NFT, right? So maybe I should pull some of them up just so I can remember. Okay, so the first edible Windows 95 screensaver NFT that you should not sleep on, as declared by the the Vatican. Okay. The first short-form generative spirograph literature NFT with audio data stored on Arweave. The first NFT to run a 4-minute mile. The first GAN NFT to be featured at the MoMA. The first copy-minted quantum AI GAN NFT to be sold at Christie's for a pittance. So it's just, these are all randomly generated from like a bunch of different text fragments and stuff straight from the contract. This series is kind of like poking fun, like ridiculing in a lot of ways certain things, but also commemorating like a lot of things about that particular time period. These were minted in a flurry, and it's satire, but I don't think everybody really understood that it was satire. Around that time, like people bought them not even knowing what it was. They didn't even know. It's just like, oh, everybody else is buying it and stuff. And I feel really bad about whatever happened with like the market for that, because in speculation, there's going to be winners and losers, and people might have lost out because of that. What I will say is that I didn't intend that to happen. And also I didn't make a cent from this because every penny of it, the primary and secondary royalties, were all donated to charity. In the first night, there was like this huge speculative wave. I think the secondary volume was like 10 or 20 million or something like that. And so all of the royalties from that, $1.4 million, went to Give Directly charity to redistribute this. That was a wild kind of experience. I feel like that series has actually held up very well. People use it sort of as memes, because if you go on Twitter, and you'll always have it be people arguing about what was the first NFT in a specific category all the time. And like, and people declaring how historic a certain NFT is because of XYZ or whatever, like some thin justification for why their bag is important. Right. And so every time any of these things happen, I can just go and look through the bingo card and find one of them and then post it as a reply. And people do this, and so it's like kind of this fun thing, kind of performance and stuff on Twitter. And so a lot of them are really funny, and it's actually held up really well, that we could still use these and people laugh about it. The other thing that's interesting is that some of the more absurd combinations that are part of this have actually come true. Like a bunch of them have actually come true. So just as an example, like I had a reference to like, the Vatican. And if you remember a couple of weeks ago, the Vatican is going to be releasing NFTs, right? So it's like, I called it, right? And
it's on chain.
Yeah, it's on chain, exactly. It's like I minted that in September. And there's other ones too, like really specific ones, but like things about like NFTs, like on the moon. And like then there's a space race between Jeff Koons and other people to land on the moon. And also other just like really specific ones that like in those categories have also come true. And at the time it was like, okay, maybe in 10 years it might come true, but a lot of them came true altogether. So what I want to do is actually make a book and put all these together with context and stuff. Like I really feel that of the work that I've done, like that's sort of one of the more meaningful series, because it says something about the market, says something about the culture, and it's entertaining. Yeah. So I stand by that. And it's not, but it's a lot different than my other work.
What really stands out to me in this conversation is just the thoughtfulness and layers that are obviously just sort of very natural to how you approach your art here. And so very, very much encourage people who are listening to go and poke around. I mean, your website looks like the most simple thing, and yet there's corners of it that I continue to discover as your work expands. So I'm really curious, I guess, what your day-to-day looks like right now. Like, what is that practice, or how are you spending your time?
Yeah, so what does my day-to-day look like? Well, it's kind of all over the map. This past month has been pretty busy. I've actually been teaching with Mitchell Chan, who's another member of Fingerprints and actually lives in my same city. We've been teaching a virtual class about blockchain and blockchain programming to youth in Canada, actually in Vancouver. It's Ethos Lab, through Ethos Lab and Interaccess. And so that took a lot of prep. Like, that actually was like a lot of time to do all that. But that was a really valuable experience. And so that's something I've been doing. I'm participating in like an exhibition that launches with Fairfile next week. And so I'm prepared. I'm going to be live streaming myself performing from my garage using generative software, and then to make a visual, and then fabricating that by forging it in iron. I have a head mounted cam and like a view monitor on my arm, and I'm going to be doing that in real time. And so I'm prepping to do that. So there's never a dull day. Like, that's a lot different than what I was doing the month before. Yeah, but like a lot of my day actually revolves around family and childcare. I've been getting up the same time every day for the past 9 years. I haven't been on a plane in 9 years. I haven't traveled like anywhere. I haven't stayed away even one night overnight from my kids. So it's a really kind of regimented in a way, but within that time that I have, like, between dropping off my kids at school and then the 6 or 7 hours that I have, it's kind of all over the map. Twitter, Discord, trying to fit in some, like, I guess, actual like art making, doing whatever it is that needs to be done. So,
Conversations with us as well in there, which I think, yeah.
oh, I love this though. Yeah.
I love this because I think we were talking earlier about the people behind some of these things. And I think that's really where there's depth in this on-chain NFT and in your work, but the depth really becomes apparent when people, I think, can listen and hear and understand the human being behind this sort of stuff. So I love, all of your story here. I asked for some questions from our community here, and I have a couple that have popped up. The one that is most intriguing to me is I'm supposed to ask you about the role Frank Zappa has played in your life.
Oh, that's so great that somebody asked about that. Oh, wow. Yeah, so Frank Zappa has played a pretty big role in my life, and I'll tell you why. It's not necessarily the musical influence that probably doesn't come through synth poems or any of those other things. But when I was a teenager, I was a guitar nerd. I was really into Steve Vai, Joe Satriani and things, but I really liked the quirkiness of some of the stuff Steve Vai did. And then from there, I learned that the quirkiness that I liked about that came from directly influence from Frank Zappa. And so in my first year university that I discovered Zappa, and I just fell down this giant rabbit hole. And I was like, no, I can't be doing this, right? I was doing computer engineering, but I was like, no, I have to try at least. So I dropped out of school and basically tried to recreate some of the experiences that Zappa had. I moved to the city and squatted in my recording studio without any kind of, we didn't have hot water. I didn't have a kitchen, or there's a bathroom, but no shower and stuff. And because I wanted to, have this environment to explore sound and create and stuff. And this is the year 2002 or something, before there was a lot of, readily available technology. So it's kind of copying Zappa in that respect, because I was just so inspired by kind of his ethos and what he did just to go out and do these weird things and stuff. That influence was pretty strong in that regard. You might be able to see a little bit also I adore humor and satire. And so you might see that especially in the first NFT collection that I described, that's sort of it's not as good as something that Zappa could do, but it's that kind of an inspiration, kind of satire to ridicule to get at the truth. You know what I mean? Shock you into realizing what it is that's going on. I would be every day I'm just man, if Frank Zappa was around now to have a commentary on some of the craziness of whatever, the world, NFT maybe specifically or whatever, but just in general, it's just yeah, that's sort of been his influence. And also I chaotic music that takes you to 100 different places, and just the large variety, continued exploration, sticking to what it is that you want to do, right? Difference between a business decision and an artistic decision. Because Zappa was a businessman as well, but he knew the difference and made decisions based on that. So yeah, he's been pretty influential in a number of ways.
I love that. This is a very different conversation than we normally have on this podcast, and I'm here for it. I feel I think I was sharing earlier, the inspiration really is, I love this idea of having fascinating conversations with folks that if you heard happening at the dinner table next to you, you'd want to lean over, and you're just a very compelling character, and love how you approach it. And I see, I live in sort of rural area outside of a major city, and very much identify with this, being able to plug into the metaverse that is Discord and Twitter. And it just seems there's, so much richness in that metaverse space already that has yet to be sort of uncovered or recognized. And it's interesting to see you sort of really pull at those threads and live that so authentically. It's, the reality. So where should we put people's attention? What's next? Where can people follow you?
To follow me, probably the best is Twitter and Discord, probably, right? Everything that's important I'll announce on those two channels. That's the best way to kind of follow along. In terms of what next, I have this exhibition that I'm doing with Ferrophile that I'll be doing that performance on Monday, and anybody can tune in. So May 30th at 1 p.m. you can tune in. It might have already happened by the time this airs, but you can still see the recording of it. And after that, I don't have any grand plans, planned for anything specific. Again, it's just sort of being in this kind of feedback loop and observing and seeing how that influences me, and exploring and seeing where it goes. And if I find something interesting through this process, then I want to share it. That's sort of been my modus operandus for the arc of basically my short career in NFTs, and also sort of the wider arc of my tinkering life.
I've been a big fan. I am even more a fan having had this opportunity to speak with you. I'm sure that'll be the case for many that are listening. So appreciate you spending some of your precious time with us on the Club podcast, and very, very excited to see what's next for you.
Thank you so much for having me, Jess. It's really great to be here and talk to you today. Thank you.